My name is Jamie Jauncey. I'm one of the directors for the festival, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here to Charlotte Square. It's also a great pleasure to welcome Rory MacLean, who's one of our most distinctive and adventurous travel writers. Rory is the author of a number of award-winning and category-defying books, including his travels into the Soviet Union, in Stalin's Nose, in a Trabant, I think, which must have been incredibly uncomfortable.
It was.
Journeying through to explore the horrors and beauty of Burma in the 1990s in Under the Dragon, building a flying machine in Crete, in Falling for Icarus, and most recently, Berlin, his big book about living in the city of Berlin, which was last year voted one of the Washington Post's top 10 books of 2014. Rory's always pushed the boundaries in his writing, and never more so in the current work. Back in the USSR, heroic adventures in Transnistria. So, Rory, Rory's going to tell us a little about Transnistria with the aid of some slides and a little bit of music to start with.
Oh, indeed.
And
yes.
Then we'll have a conversation, and we'll invite you to join in the conversation. So sit back and enjoy hearing about Transnistria.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Friends, comrades, come and join me on a journey into the heart of the new Russian Revolution. Come and join me in the heroic People's Republic of Transnistria. Now, may I ask those of you who it comes easily to please be upstanding for the Transnistrian national anthem, please. Enough of that. Thank you. Transnistria. Transnistria is a breakaway republic of the old Soviet Union, run by KGB and Russian oligarchs, proud, independent, profitable, and above all, strategic. Yet, it's a nowhere land which is recognized by no other country in the world. No bigger than Cornwall, this upstart mini-state hugs a narrow valley, it's the purple bit there, near to the Black Sea, looks to Lenin and Stalin for leadership, has a Facebook-savvy foreign minister, its oligarchs in Adidas tracksuits hunt wild boar with AK-47s, very, very effective, I understand. Its young people train for revolution at the Che Guevara High School for political leadership. Its secret factories have supplied arms to Chechnya and electrical cable for Iran's nuclear power system. It is unique in being the only country in the world not to recognize the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yet its supporters champion it as a peace-loving exemplar of cyber-age democracy. Friends, comrades, last year I visited this terra incognita with photojournalist Nick Danziger. On our month-long journey, we were granted special access, exclusive access, to many of Transnistria's key places and people. Why? Because we are astute political observers? Because we are very special people? Because our mothers loved us? No. Because we had a personal contact with the president's lover. But more on that later. Comrades, this morning, as a way of introducing you to the wonders of the Republic, I'd like to pose two burning questions. What is the point of Transnistria? And what is it good for? First and foremost, Transnistria is good for old communists. At the end of an alley behind Tiraspol No. 3 compulsory school stands the headquarters of the Communist Party of Transnistria. I won't ask you to stand again, but I'll take it as read. A concrete Lenin surveys the front hall next to the Lavazza coffee machine. The Soviet Union is the place where I was born. It is my motherland, declared Oleg Korzan, the last communist deputy in the last Supreme Soviet. My job as party leader is to preserve and to carry forward the positive attributes of the USSR, its power, its social guarantees, its absence of borders, and above all, its belief in tomorrow. As a Westerner, you will not understand the importance of the land, of the soul to us, he explained to me. The Western soul is like a fenced garden, well nurtured, well maintained, with a sensible structure. Our soul, our Slav dusha, is totally different. It is wild. It is open. It has no limit. It is like a vast steppe from which we get all that nourishes us, but in which we become lost. Perhaps it is because of the Slav soul that across Transnistria, the historical symbols of communism are kept alive. Indeed, Lenin stands in most town squares. Tiraspol's main street is named October Revolution. These symbols encourage people to respect history and bond together the people or peoples of the former USSR. But of course, that's the rub. Transnistria, as you'll have noticed from the map, is 500 miles away from Mother Russia, with a bothersome, no longer communist country called Ukraine in the middle. So, Transnistria is good for old communists. It's better for business. Transnistria is a puppet state created by former Red Army officers, Russian oligarchs, and the KGB in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Its original purpose was to be, quite simply, a criminalized terra incognita, used, it is believed, for smuggling and trafficking. Cigarettes, chicken, they're big on chicken, alcohol, and people. For example, among this state's many dubious financial deals, this is the one which really captures my imagination, was the sale of the vast publicly owned Kurchan power station, which supplied electricity not only to Transnistria, but to Moldova and Odessa and much of the Ukraine as well. 1 year after its surprise sale to a Belgian shell company for a knockdown price, it was bought by Russia's state electricity producer, netting the managers, some of whom were on the boards of both companies, oh, isn't that curious, about $100 million. The non-state has also thrived on more explosive business deals. At the end of the Cold War, as many of you will know, the Red Army left Eastern Germany in 1994, and they had 1 or 2 munitions with them. And what do you do with all these old munitions? Well, they dumped them in Transnistria. 40,000 tons of old Soviet weapons and ammunition, which now magically have turned up in the Balkans, in Chechnya, in the Congo. They're very shrewd businessmen. It's the Transnistrians. So good for business, good for communists, and good for football. You didn't expect that one, did you? It's a tricky question any businessman must ask himself. You know, here you have $100 million. Well, you can't go to the local HSBC and put it in the deposit account. Well, actually, some people can. So what do you do with that, with $100 million? Certain Transnistrians dealt with this problem by creating a breathtakingly wealthy football club, FC Sheriff Tiraspol, that's determined to dominate the European Champions League. And curiously, all business in this Never Never land is dominated by one omnipresent private business, Sharif. It was founded by two KGB officers who had been the former president's sheriffs during the Independence War. But unlike Wild West lawmen, these sheriffs' intentions had not only been to fight crime. As well as the football team and sports complex, their company, Sheriff, has come to control a bank, a chain of petrol stations, a mobile phone network, a couple of radio and television stations, two bread factories, and a dozen supermarkets. But it's the sports complex and football clubs that are both the company's richest and boldest holding, built up over the last decade at a cost of more than $20 million. When filled to capacity, the three FIFA-approved, they had a lovely visit, I'm told, FIFA-approved arenas seat 1/10 of Transnistria's entire population. FC Sheriff Tiraspol is a highly lucrative business. They train local kids, select the best, sell them on to Eastern European leagues. As one local man whispered to Nick and I during our trip, he said FC Sheriff Tiraspol, as the republic itself, was a cash laundrette. So, good for business, good for communists, good for football. It's also good for nationalist extremists. Yay! As I wrote in the book, Che Guevara lives in Transnistria. His portrait gazes out from the sunshine yellow banners of Priov, defiant, inspirational, iconic, and wildly out of place. The Priov, or Breakthrough Youth Movement, is, according to its glossy manifesto, like thunder, like a basin of icy water, like an avalanche that makes the world look at Transnistrian youth in a new way. Priov's Children of the Sun rally together against war and defeatists, as well as epidemics, natural cataclysms, and loneliness. Its ambition is, quote, eternal and indestructible union with Russia, remember Ukraine's bothersome bit in a way, along with the overthrow of all the illusions of the modern world, capitalism, globalization, world market of goods and services, mania of consumption. It also hopes to banish money. Very ambitious. And Nick and I met its yoga teaching leader, Dmitry Sowin. And Sowin told us, when I founded the movement, I wanted to find a symbol, Che Guevara, that was both romantic and revolutionary, a figure which meant independence both within Transnistria and abroad. I chose Che Guevara because the kids think he's really cool. Once, Sowin had been a KGB officer, brandishing sword and shield for party. Now he is wanted by Interpol for murder, as well as for his involvement in an attempt to sell an armed Alazan missile to an undercover Sunday Times journalist for £140,000. Curiously, and on a slightly more serious note, Sowin, like the communist deputy Kozan, they cling to a dream of life under Russia's guidance because in the fall of the Berlin Wall and with the end of the Cold War, many people still in Eastern Europe have a sense of groundlessness. All that had been certain for them in their earlier life went in November 1989. So comrades, what else is Transnistria good for? It is good for lovers. At least it's good for the president's lovers. Within hours of his election victory, the new president, Evgeny Shevchuk, replaced dozens of craggy bureaucrats with Shev's chicks. His new Minister of Justice had just marked her 30th birthday. His Minister of Economic Development was 32. The new Director of National Television, with whom Nick and I waited for a telephone call from Vladimir Putin, was a rosy-cheeked 28. Apart from utilizing these impeccable young women's bright vitality and expertise, the president's intention was to sex up the republic's image abroad, letting their sheen obscure the shadows of the past, perhaps shadows of the present too. Above all, I'd like to draw your attention to his, well, in my opinion, drop-dead gorgeous foreign minister, Nina Shatansky, age 34, who has caused a bit of a stir, almost a frisson, in diplomatic circles. In the weeks after her appointment, Shatansky's beauty, as well as her fresh and sharp intelligence, transformed Transnistria's image abroad. Diplomats from Brussels, from London, from Geneva started to queue up to gaze across the wide Soviet-era boardroom table at her. And much at the same time, she launched a personal PR campaign on Facebook. One of her first posts read, "Good morning, friends, countries, continents. Wishing you a great week. May the news only be good, the winter frosts only kind, and meetings warm." Her candid, snappy posts about her love of fashion, home baking, and Magner's Irish cider, actually, and her astute comments on trade and political negotiations truly did reverse the outmoded Cold War stereotypes, making the Republic appear to be trendily modern. Her likes, by the way, for those of you who haven't signed up, she's got 5,000 friends, so you can add to that. Her likes include Chanel, Esquire Russia, and, surprise, surprise, Vladimir Putin. Another of her daily posts read, "People of Tiraspol is the capital of Transnistria, tell me please, where is the best place to go roller skating?" But again, hint of seriousness. Her Facebook diplomacy has disseminated information about Transnistria, wrapped in an attractive package. And as you'll appreciate, as Transnistria is not recognized by any country in the world, it has no embassies. So it's quite a shrewd way of creating a presence overseas, promoting the country overseas. So finally, Transnistria is good for Vladimir Putin. Comrades, Moscow considers Transnistria to be of crucial geopolitical importance, straddling as it does the borders of the EU and NATO, as well as Ukraine. As you'll have noticed, the Nowhere Land, which has been occupied by Russian peacekeepers for 20 years, is on the Ukraine's western border. Therefore, with Russia's presence in the east, in the Donbass and Crimea, Ukraine is surrounded on two fronts. Back in the USSR, Nick and I have tried to illustrate how Russia takes control of countries from within through subversion, criminal activities, and ownership of media outlets. I don't need to remind you that President Putin refers to all of southern Ukraine and Transnistria as New Russia, an historical term for the land once controlled by all of the Russian Empire. So, comrades, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Welcome back to the USSR. Welcome to one of the front lines of Russia's hybrid covert war. Welcome to Transnistria, a nowhere land that is no joke. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. When I first opened the book and saw the northwesterly corner of the map with a arrow to Harrods, 1,600 miles, I had to look at the publication date to make sure it wasn't April the 1st. It's a very confusing place, this. But I mean, your trip there has come out of your work with Nick Danziger. I mean, you've done some very serious work with Nick in the past, and I'm not saying that this isn't serious. But just tell us a little bit more about how it all came about.
Back in the USSR began when Nick and I were approached to do a, as you say, much more serious project for the ICRC, the International Red Cross. As some of you will know, during the former Yugoslav wars, 40,000 civilians went missing. There would have been a knock at the door late at night. A policeman or someone out of uniform would say, "Oh, please come down to the police station. We just want to ask you a few questions." And the father or mother would go out and never be seen again. And that happened 40,000 times during those years. And the ICRC wanted to pay respect to the families of the bereaved, to show that the international community was aware of the suffering that had befallen them. And they decided to create a book and an exhibition on the missing of the Yugoslav wars. So that's what Nick and I did. That's when I had known Nick for many years, but we hadn't seen each other for a decade or something. And so they approached us to do the project. And during the driving trip, we drove, I think, 5,000 or 6,000 miles over 4 months through former Yugoslavia, going to meet some of the families, 15 families of the bereaved. The head of the ICRC in the region, a man named Paul-Henri Arny, he told us a story about this place called Transnistria. And he's a great joker, Paul-Henri. And we thought, yeah. And he would tell the story about the beautiful Nina Shatansky, who then wasn't the lover of the president. She was then just a translator. Told us about the Minister of Labour, who had helped to lead, a retired Red Army officer who had helped to lead the tanks into Prague in 1968 and retired to lovely Transnistria. He loved animals, and he had a private zoo inside the Ministry of Justice. Anaconda sliding. I'm not joking. I make things up, but not this. Anaconda sliding along the hallway of the Ministry of Justice. And Nick and I thought, we have to see this place. This is, and we're of course very interested in borders, in edges, in the meeting points between two cultures. And Transnistria, Transnistra, the country which is on the borders on both sides of the Dniester or Dnistru River, that is seen as one of the historical dividing lines between Western Europe and Slavic Europe.
And having decided to go there, you had to find yourself a guide, didn't you? And so there is this mysterious new Soviet man who seems to be able to open all the doors for you. What first of all is new Soviet man, and then who was? Or perhaps you can't say, but tell us a little bit more.
Very little about this. You will know that during certainly during Stalinist days, that the ideal of new Soviet man was created. A selfless human being who stood upright, who placed the state above all else, and it was healthy, ate his breakfast, looked after his mother, all those sort of things, and. This new Soviet man, the ideal of new Soviet man, sort of quietly passed away, I guess, under Khrushchev or Brezhnev, and the idea of a new Soviet man, who of course is very market aware, very shrewd, knows where to make a dollar, knows what power stations to sell, knows what backhanders to give. I think, unfortunately, but that's the reality. That is new Soviet man today, and. In places like Transnistria and Moscow and SW10 in London, you see a great many very, very, very wealthy new Soviet men and women. And
you found one?
We found one and
you
traveled
refer occasionally to his Bentley, so I assume you travelled through Transnistria
SUV Bentleys, and yes, we travelled. Well, we travelled in all. As usual, we'd like to have the variety, so we travelled in all forms.
So you arrived in Transnistria, and I mean, you had some idea that there was a sort of comic opera character to it. When you came to writing about it, Nick's photographs, as you will have seen, are very powerful. A lot of them are very melancholy, perhaps as you'd expect. How did you decide on the approach you were going to take? I mean, was there only one way to write about this place, which is as you have done?
It's a good question. I think it would have been I'm not an academic. I'm fascinated by history, but I'm just an amateur historian, and I was fascinated by the audacity by which the individuals had created this country, and I wanted to tell that story. And of course, as in my book on Berlin, Imagine a City, there are many gifted historians who could write a very serious, learned, academic work, could do it infinitely better than me. But I have shared this with Nick. I want to tell the human story, the individual stories. The book, My History of Berlin, is the portrait of 24 individuals. It tells the history of the city through the individuals. And it's not that dissimilar back in the USSR. There are about 15, 16 individuals, and I tell their story.
The one that stuck out for me was Marina, the journalist with a sort of hard luck story. Tell us a little bit more about her.
Oh, sorry. Traveling through Transnistria, Nick and I have gone on to do other projects, including one in North Korea. We're the lucky ones. We fly into a country, and I don't see us as journalists at all. We don't fly in, do 24 hours, get the copy, fly out. We spend at least a month in a place trying to some extent, get under the skin. And in Transnistria and in North Korea, we could leave. We were so lucky, and we could leave. Yet, in both those places, there's such a sense of fear. Most people don't have the opportunity to leave. They have to stay. Certainly in North Korea, no one has the opportunity to leave, or virtually no one. They have to live in that system, those systems. And I've lost my train now a little, thinking about North Korea.
We're talking about Marina, but actually you you also mentioned, and I mean I can't let this go, you mentioned that you and Nick had been to North Korea, and I think most people are fascinated to know what goes. I mean, you are amongst a handful of people from the West who've been in there. I know we're really talking about the book, but can we digress for a minute or two and hear a little bit about North Korea too, because that's such an extraordinary and frightening place.
It is a frightening place. God, I don't like to use such a simple way, but it is frightening. I have never on the street felt such. Our trip was made very easy for us. We were looked after, of course. We were fed well. We were put in the nice hotel. There's 2 Western hotels for Westerners in Pyongyang. But you walk down the street, and you can't walk down the street by yourself. You always have to go with a guide. You can't go for a stroll around the hotel. It has to be your guide with you, your minder. And you just feel a fear. But the most shocking fact, I think, which for me just explains so much about North Korea, is the North Koreans, for the last 40 years, have been required, everyone in North Korea has been required to keep a weekly diary. 2/3 of the diary is writing about one's own failings. I failed to polish the portrait of the great leader. I failed to work hard enough. I did not honor my husband, whatever. But the last third of this diary, this weekly diary, is to criticize someone else, to criticize your partner, your teacher, your schoolmate, your neighbor. And of course, most people find a way to write something innocuous, but you do that for 40 years, for a generation and a half, and it changes the way you look at your neighbors, you look at classmates, and that's the sort of fear I'm talking about. It just sort of, they are so guarded and so careful in what they say. And of course, these diaries are seen by the teacher or the head of the work unit or the political officer. And if there's something in there which is out of line, then it's passed up to the appropriate authority.
What was the project that took you there?
The project was, some of you may know, Jamie, you kindly mentioned that I wrote a book called Under the Dragon on Burma, and after that book came out, I was banned for 17 years for going. And when the changes started coming about in Burma, it suddenly struck me they had lived since 1962 under a totalitarian dictatorship. When the first signs of democracy returned, I thought, well, that's 2 generations. How does an individual who's always a writer or a photographer, has always written indirectly about things or always photographed not directly, how do they start addressing issues directly? How do they find the way to write critically and honestly? And so I came up with an idea and asked Nick if he'd like to get involved, and he said yes. Nick and I go to Burma under the auspices of the British Council and offer a dozen journalists, writers, photographers, the chance to tell one true story they hadn't had the chance to tell before. And we were flooded with applications, and it was such a moving occasion. They wrote the most moving stories about drug abuse, about abuse by the military, and there was an exhibition with the text and the photographs with Aung San Suu Kyi came to, and it was such a moving experience. And of course, all the Burmese who came to the exhibition, they knew these sort of stories, these generic stories, if you like, but they'd never seen them up on the wall in the catalogue. And so they were photographing the photographs and writing down the text, and Nick and I were both so moved by this experience that we thought, well, where shall we do this next? Well, North Korea, we thought. Well, there's no flowering of democracy in North Korea. And the North Koreans, we approached them at the embassy here. They were enthusiastic because the British Council offered exhibition space and a catalogue in just off Trafalgar Square. And so they were enthusiastic. They agreed that we could go to the country with the deputy head of the British Council. We would then be given, of course they were selected for us, we had a measure of choice, but of course they'd all be party members, we were aware of that. We were given a dozen individuals, and they would have the chance to tell the one true story about North Korea they'd never had the chance to tell before. Great. We flew there, paid money, flew there, and we got there, and they said, oh, we can't do it this way. And so they twisted the whole thing around. So in the end, they said, we can't bring people in. No, they're all on their work detail. How can we arrange this? And I've never had other dealings with North Korean officialdom, but I understand this is not an unusual pattern of behavior, shall we say, that one thing is agreed to, initial fees are paid, all the contacts are made, the overseas organization makes the commitment, and then once you're there in the country, they change the rules.
Was it perhaps a little naive to expect that you were going to be given carte blanche when you got out there?
We're optimists.
So what did you end up with on that trip?
What we did, every morning was a battle. To get into someone's house, I think took at least 10 hours of arguing. And just to vote, because we wanted to have North Koreans show their life. That wasn't possible. So in the end, we had to show North Korean life. And we were allowed in eventually into factories, into houses, into the life of a 5-star general. So yes.
And you made of it what you could.
Yes. Yeah.
So I mean, you're drawn to explore repressive regimes, obviously. I mean, Transnistria is slightly different there because it's the consequence of the collapse of a repressive regime, really, isn't it? Yeah. And just so that I'm absolutely clear, it still belongs to Moldova. Is that correct? I mean,
that was certainly what a Moldovan would say.
Yes, although it there was a war of independence 25 years ago,
yes.
And they had a referendum not that long ago about joining Russia.
Yes.
At which 97% voted to join Russia.
Yes.
And Moscow, a deafening silence came down the line from Moscow. Why?
Well, because Moldova, Transnistria is very useful for Putin, because it's a, what's the expression? It's a pea under the mattress. It's a needle in the back. I can't think of the right one. Especially for Chancellor Merkel, because there is an undefined state on the edge of Europe, which officially is part of Moldova. It was just to add a little to your very clear history. Stalin, in his usual way, when he took over Moldova in the Second World War, at the end of the Second War, he attached Transnistria to Moldova. And Transnistria had been traditionally much more Slavic, where, of course, Moldova was much more Romantic, much more Roman Western. And so, as he had done in other parts of the world, other parts of former Soviet Union, created a flashpoint. And so the separation was, if you like, that bit that Stalin had tacked on. They had in 1992, they had an independence war. 800 people were killed. So, but its motivation was not, I believe, a sincere a cry from the people for independence. It was motivated by political and monetary expediency.
And of course, a further spanner in the works now with the Ukraine situation, because Ukraine is the eastern border of the country too, isn't it?
Yes.
So Russia, am I right in thinking that there are Russian peacekeepers still in Transnistria?
4,500.
And the Russians now can't get at them, except through Moldova.
That's right, yes. It's become quite difficult because, of course, they've had the peacekeepers there. And yes, the peacekeepers did go out in 1992 and stop the fighting, but they stayed. And they were supplied for many years through the Ukraine. That's not possible now. So there is a line of thought that Novorossiya, that all of that northern flank of the Black Sea should become part of Russia in some way or other in the future. I don't know. I don't think President Putin has worked out a master plan in detail. I think he just sees Transnistria as a very useful pawn, which he could use in the future. I think it's the Baltic states we have to watch next.
And you mentioned the lovely Nina, and her social media diplomacy. But I mean, she hasn't presented her credentials at the court of St. James, obviously.
No.
So I mean, how do these officials? What do they really believe about the country, the so-called country that they purport to represent?
I can't really answer that. I think someone like Nina and probably her boss, the president, Shevchuk, I think they believe in the independence of Transnistria, that it should be a complete entity. But it will never be recognized by the EU. Russia doesn't want to recognize it because it keeps it in that nowhere land. So I think it's just going to stay there like a thorn. That's it, thorn in the side.
But I mean, it's got some. It's full of anomalies, isn't it? I mean, the Dixieland band, for example.
Yes. And the passports. Passports, yes. How does someone like Nina travel? Well, she cannot travel as a foreign minister, of course, because nobody recognizes her. So she has certainly. Well, every Transnistrian has two passports. They have a Transnistrian passport, which isn't recognized anywhere, and they have either a Ukrainian, a Russian, or a Moldovan passport, depending on their family links or their own links. And so they travel on those.
And what's life like for the ordinary Transnistrian?
Well, 25 years ago, there were 800,000 Transnistrians. Now there's around 400,000. They leave, and the economy of Transnistria is totally reliant on money from abroad. I don't know more than the 400,000 have left, but most of those are of working age, and they've gone to work, curiously, in Turin or Ukraine and or Russia, and they send money home, and that keeps the country afloat until the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Can we call it the invasion? I don't know about that. the elderly of Transnistria were kept alive by the Putin pension, which was $10 a month that was sent from Russia. And for example, when we were there talking about fear again, everyone said, Putin, he's a master, he's wonderful, he's the great leader of Russia, we want to be reunited with him. Nobody would say anything against the authorities. So it's a very hard life. If you don't have family abroad and if you don't get a Putin pension, it's a hard life.
You're not a beneficiary of the money launderette.
Ah, yes, or a president's lover.
They do. They export an enormous amount of alcohol, don't they? I was surprised to read that. Kvint, is it called Kvint?
Kvint, yes. It's one of the growth industries of Transnistria. And it's owned by Sheriff as well, the great company. They produce a huge amount of alcohol, which they sell to the most obscure countries like Papua New Guinea and Colombia. Well, obscure to me. Papua New Guinea and Colombia, because they showed us their order book, which they were so proud of. No sales to the UK or the United States.
But it's cognac.
It's anything you can imagine. Yeah, so it's good for window washers fluid. Actually, it's really good, the cognac, the Kvint cognac. But it's also vodka and wines that they do as well.
But it's not a place to be poor. I mean, there are a couple of photographs that really illustrate that very graphically.
It's not a place to be poor.
And it's a very, very corrupt place. I think there's a statistic somewhere that 60% of the orphaned children end up in the sex trade or something. Is that correct?
Yes, well, that's what we were told.
Girls.
Yes, yeah. That's what we were told by the IOM. We were told that was the figure. It's shocking because, as I mentioned in my little talk, Transnistria was used for trafficking cigarettes, alcohol, and people smuggling as well. And that includes sex trade. I have been told it is less than it was. Transnistria is trying to clean up its act, certainly to appear, and not only on Facebook, to appear to be more of a legitimate state. It has its own currency, its own parliament. It's had its own army. It has all the trappings, its own postage stamps. It has all the trappings of a modern state. Just nobody recognizes it.
You have a sort of jokey timeline at the end of the book with a couple of entertaining sort of tail pieces towards the end of the present decade. Just tell us about the Eurovision Song Contest.
Yes, but perhaps I think I see that Neil Shatansky is going to have bare triplets in 2018, and I don't know my footballers, but I can't remember some great footballer will be conscripted, drafted by FC Tiraspol Sheriff in the future. But what I'm trying to do with that is we don't know what will happen with Transnistria. I think.
What's your guess?
Well, I think we're we're in the early stages of a very unstable period in the eastern parts of Europe because of how President Putin has based his huge popularity, or his huge popularity has come out of him being a tough man and him standing up for the idea of a greater Russia, historically greater Russia. I think that has, in a way, put him in a position where he has to keep being tough, as we've seen in Ukraine, as we see with the flights of the Russian bombers along the Channel, the incursions into the Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. I think it's a very dangerous time because the Soviet Union in Russia, there's been historically a quite dramatic change of leaders. If something like that were to start to happen within President Putin's court, would he not be tempted to distract the home audience by creating an incident abroad?
A little backyard trouble. the clinging to the old sort of tenets of communism is one of the really peculiar things about this place, because it doesn't actually chime with anywhere, does it? It doesn't chime with Europe. It doesn't chime with modern Russia.
And they're all capitalists. All the
they're
people
all
in control.
capitalists.
Yes.
So it's a very. I mean, you really fell down the rabbit hole into Wonderland, didn't you?
You think you're back in Russia or deep Eastern Europe, circa 1979. But of course, the symbols of communism, they are the only thing, or the only obvious thing that can be used to hold together these, because there's three main ethnic groups in Transnistria. And what do they all share? Having lived and survived those years under the communists. So they now celebrate those.
We've got just over 10 minutes to take some questions. It's a fascinating place. I'm sure that you have some questions. We have one right in the front row. We'll just put the house lights up and we'll get a microphone for you. Right in the front row here.
Hello. I wonder if anybody can get to Transnistria. You cannot apply for a visa, I guess, but can you get there and you enter and that's it, or what's the situation?
You can enter very easily in the daylight hours. But you better not want to sleep there. It's very easy if you're in Chisinau and you want to go to the capital of Moldova and you want to go into Transnistria for the day. It's very easy. You take a bus over the border and happily wander. If you go beyond that, then you have to apply for a visa. And yes, it is possible. Nick and I were allowed to stay, but that's because of our contact. But it is possible. But
now you can really go out and back on the same day?
Yes. And it's very common. Yes, when we were there, Nick and I were known as, it became apparent, Nina told us we were the journalists who had stayed there longer than any other Western journalist. We'd stayed there a month. Well, Nick was slightly less than a month. I was there a month. And most journalists go over from Moldova, go over for the day, find a quick story, write it up, and then leave.
And people from there, they can also travel. It's not like Korea, I guess. They can travel freely to Chisinau.
Can Transnistrians travel out easily? That's the question.
Certainly much easier than North Korea. It depends what passport you have. I think generally they can travel. Any Transnistrian can travel into Moldova. Of course, because the reason the smuggling was so easy, as you may know, was because when Transnistria broke away, Moldova, of course, didn't recognize it. So it didn't patrol the border. So there was this open border, and the people in Transnistria who had contacts in the Ukraine, well, there was no border there because it had all been part of the Soviet Union. And so it was free flow of goods across the borders there, so into Europe, which is what bothered Chancellor Merkel.
Is there any dialogue between Transnistria and Moldova?
Yes, very slow dialogue. I think it took a year or two to decide that, because there's some great difficulties in practical terms, like the train from Odessa to Moldova used to have to go practically up to Kiev, and I think it took
to avoid Transnistria.
Yes, yeah. And then it took it took two or 3 years, and then permission was agreed for that. So yes, their discussions do go on.
Yes, a question up at the back there.
Thanks, Rory. You spoke about some of the other pieces of work that you've did that were funded by the British Council or the International Red Cross. Of course, this piece of work was effectively crowdfunded.
Yes.
What difference did that make on the process of actually writing the book, where, in effect, you were in charge of your own brief rather than writing to someone else's brief?
I would say in terms of editorial that it made no difference, because I always write the way I want to write, what I see as the only way to tell a certain story. Just to talk briefly about, for those of you who don't know, this book, as one of Jamie's books, was crowdfunded by Unbound, three writers had decided a couple of years ago that they were thoroughly fed up with big publishing companies and only receiving 6 or 7% of the cover price of their book for all their hard labor. So they set up a publishing enterprise called Unbound, which is crowdfunded. A book like back in the USSR or Jamie's book appears on the website, and people pledge so much. So for £10 you get an e-copy of the book. The book doesn't exist at that point. £10 you get an e-copy, £20 you get a hardback, £50 you get a lucky you signed hardback, and I think £125 you get invited to the launch party, which is the big money maker. And because we'd hoped to bring Nina Shatansky to the launch party, and we'd had all the vodka supplied and had the cider there ready for her, but she didn't come,
We
sadly.
sold a product placement in ours for £1,000,
Oh.
which we were very pleased about. But it's not vanity publishing, it's something slightly
No.
different,
No,
because
no.
there is an editorial team at Unbound who then decide whether or not your project is something that they want to have within their stable.
Yes.
We had a question down in the front here.
I'm not sure that I agree with you about Transnistria. I worked there at the collapse of the former Soviet Union,
Yes.
when General Lebed turned his guns on both sides to create peace, which he successfully did. The Tiraspol power station in Transnistria provided Kiev after the Chernobyl explosion. They turned the electricity north. So it was very key,
Yes,
but it was
yeah.
controlled and from effectively St. Petersburg, from the power generation side of the Soviet Union. And the 20th Parachute Regiment and the airfield at Transnistria were key to Russia at the time. I think that the West's interference in Ukraine, in the Yanukovych, in upsetting what was a democratically elected government, despite the style of it, with Senator McCain and the Germans and others there wanting the greater Europe, I think that created a complete imbalance in the whole area. And I think Transnistria will probably remain as it is, because the Russians in Transnistria have nowhere to go. They've been there perhaps 2 or 3 generations now with the power station and the army and so forth. And there's nowhere back in Russia for them to go. And they don't wish to be part of Moldova, because that's Romanian speaking, and it's a different culture. So I think that you have an anomaly, and it will remain that way.
Yes, very true. It is an anomaly. I think all I would add to that is in Ukraine, in Transnistria, there is huge corruption, huge levels of corruption. And how can any state ever be run with any measure of pluralism or fairness with those sort of levels of corruption?
Sorry, could we have the microphone back? Yeah.
Sorry. You have mafia controlling the nuclear power station that provides Odessa. I mean, the corruption in Ukraine has been going on since the collapse of the former Soviet Union.
Yes.
And you've got a whole... The army is really feudal lords or fiefdoms or oligarchs who fund the Ukrainian army. They fund different regiments. So, I mean, you've got a total mess,
Yes.
a total carve-up.
Well, in Transnistria, as in Odessa, as in Moscow, well, not many ox carts in Moscow, but in the south there are peasant carts moving around the streets, and then the sleekest new Mercedes or Rolls or Bentley will shoot by with tinted windows.
With you in it.
I'm out now. You get a lovely view. It's a nice ride.
Hi, Rory. Thank you so much. When in your writing you talk about you tell your story through the people that you encounter in those places, and often you have great empathy or love for the characters that you're writing about. You find something in them that really excites you and engages you. And I wondered if you could just talk about one or some of the characters that you met there that had that same engagement with you. I have the sense that with the foreign minister, there's a distance there, there's a humour there, but maybe not love. I don't know. But I mean, how about the characters that really engaged you there?
Well, thank you. The key for me is empathy. You know, as a travel writer who's branched into history, we can travel to any corner of the globe. We can, and so what value is travel writing in sort of a very objective, cold, factual sense? You know, we can look things up on the internet. So for me, what moves me most and is most important to me in my writing is writing about people who touch me, to try to understand their lives in the hope that the reader will then, through that portrait, begin to empathize with them and begin to feel what it's like. Of course, they can read the cold facts about how many child prostitutes there are in North Korea, how many starving in whatever. They can read those cold facts anywhere, but it doesn't touch them. So to read big numbers, it doesn't move them like one story.
So what's the one that really stood out for you?
In Transnistria, I think it must be, and I've now forgotten her name, which is not a good step. Marina, thank you. Yes, Marina, who... Marina, she wanted to be a ballet dancer, but she often argued with her mother, and so to persuade her to go to ballet class, her mother would give her a big piece of creamy cake at the end of every ballet class, which was great for the first couple of weeks, but then Marina started getting heavier and heavier and heavier, and she could no longer do the dancing. And then she met and fell in love with a soldier, Red Army as it was then, but then with the collapse of communism, he turned to alcohol. He started beating her, and she just had to reinvent herself as an independent woman. And it's a very brief sketch. The husband died, and they were all but starving, and she became a press officer for the Supreme Soviet, and then was thrown out because to survive she had to work on the side. And so telling a story like that, like the story, sort of stories all of us have, I find it so moving, and I want to share that so a reader can then imagine what it would be like to be Marina and live her life under those pressures, and imagine, we are so blessed and so lucky living in this country and these countries, and we forget so quickly how lucky we are. And telling Marina's story, telling the story of the farmer in North Korea.
It's at the heart of all good travel writing, isn't it, really? It's the human connection that brings it alive for us. Yeah. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. We're out of time. A couple of things to say. First of all, Rory will be signing in the signing area just behind us after the event. And also, he asked me to say that he's running a workshop at the Scottish Arts Club.
That's right.
On the 30th and 31st of this month, a 2-day writing workshop. And I believe that a couple of the ladies involved will be at the door. So if it interests you, ask for Hilary or Sarah. Is that right?
That's right.
As you go out, 2-day writing workshop with Rory. I would do it like a shot if I had the time. But anyway, thank you all for coming. And please, big round of applause, Rory MacLean.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.